The secret 1930s plot to overthrow the White House and install a dictator. The year was 1933 and the United States was under pressure from every direction. Banks had collapsed, millions were out of work, confidence in the system was slipping fast. Then a new president stepped in, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and began pushing changes at a pace the country had never seen before. For many, it felt like progress. For others, it felt like something far more dangerous. So within no time, they made up a plan to overthrow the White House and install a dictator. So how close did that plan actually come to happening? Well, here is the full story. A crisis that made the unthinkable possible. By the early 1930s, the United States was deep into the Great Depression. Around 13 to 15 million people were unemployed, which meant roughly 1 in 4 workers had no job. Banks failed in waves. By 1933, thousands had already collapsed, taking people's savings with them. In some cities, lines for food stretched for blocks. In others, people built makeshift homes out of scrap materials just to survive. And when a system starts breaking down like that, confidence disappears quickly. That's where Franklin D. Roosevelt came in. Within his first 100 days in office, he pushed through a series of aggressive reforms, what became known as the New Deal. The government stepped directly into banking, industry, and employment in ways it hadn't done before. Programs were created almost overnight. Regulations tightened. Federal authority expanded at speed. For millions of Americans, this looked like action. Finally, something was being done. For others, especially some of the country's wealthiest figures, it looked like something far less reassuring. Because these weren't small adjustments. These were structural changes that affected banks, corporations, and private wealth directly. Policies like banking regulation, labour protections, and public works spending started shifting the balance of power. At the same time, across the Atlantic, something else was happening. In countries like Italy and Germany, governments were moving in a very different direction. Centralised control, strong leadership, and systems that promised stability without political gridlock. And to some observers, those systems looked effective. Now, most people saw those developments and kept their distance. But a small number didn't. And in the middle of economic collapse, rising fear, and global political shifts, a dangerous idea started to take shape. If the system could be reshaped this quickly, it could also be controlled. The kind of coup they had in mind. The idea that began circulating during this period didn't look like the kind of coup most people would imagine. There were no plans for tanks rolling through Washington, no sudden takeover of government buildings, no dramatic announcement declaring a new regime. That kind of approach would have triggered immediate resistance, and more importantly, it would have failed. What was being discussed was far more calculated. The goal was control, quiet, structured, and difficult to challenge once in place. At the time, several countries in Europe had already begun experimenting with systems where power didn't always sit with the official head of state. Leaders remained in position, gave speeches and represented the nation publicly, while real authority operated behind the scenes. It created stability on the surface and control underneath. And that model caught attention, because in the United States, removing Franklin D. Roosevelt outright would have been nearly impossible. He had just been elected, he was popular. Any direct move against him would have triggered backlash across the country. So the thinking moved in a different direction. Instead of removing the president, you leave him in place. You introduce a new position, something that sounded administrative, even helpful, a role that could be justified during a national emergency. The title that later came up in testimony was Secretary of General Affairs. On paper, it sounded harmless. In practice, it would have shifted decision-making power away from the president and into the hands of someone else. Someone who could assist in managing the crisis, coordinate national efforts, and gradually take over the real responsibilities of governing, all without dismantling the system people believed they were still living under. Because that was the key to the entire idea. If everything looked normal, most people wouldn't question it. If the president was still standing, speaking, and signing documents, the structure appeared intact. And once that structure remained in place, control could move quietly, step by step, into different hands, which made the plan far more dangerous than anything loud or obvious. Because it didn't rely on force, it relied on people not realizing what was happening. And that kind of plan only works if the right person is leading it. The one man. So for a plan like this one to move beyond conversation, it needed something very specific. Credibility. Not money, not influence. Those are already available. What it needed was a figure people would trust immediately. Someone who could stand in front of thousands of men and have them follow without hesitation. And that narrowed the list down quickly. Enter Smedley Butler. By the early 1930s, Butler was one of the most decorated Marines in US history. He had received 2 Medals of Honor, which was rare even among career military officers. He had served in multiple conflicts, built a reputation for leadership, and more importantly had credibility that extended far beyond the military. Veterans trusted him, and that mattered a lot. Because after World War I, the United States had millions of veterans, many of whom were struggling during the Great Depression. Jobs were scarce, benefits were limited, and frustration was growing. In 1932, thousands of veterans had already marched on Washington during the Bonus Army protest, demanding early payment of promised bonuses. The movement showed something important. Veterans could organise, and they could mobilise in large numbers. So if someone wanted to assemble a force quickly, something big enough to influence politics, this was the group to turn to. And if someone wanted that group to follow orders, they needed Butler. He also had another quality that made him even more valuable. He was known for speaking his mind. By this point in his life, Butler had become increasingly critical of war profiteering and political decisions that sent soldiers into conflict. He wasn't seen as a puppet. He wasn't tied closely to political elites. That independence made him more believable in the eyes of ordinary Americans, which meant if he stood at the front of a movement, it wouldn't look staged. It would look real, and that was exactly what the plan required, because without him, this idea stayed theoretical. With him, it had the potential to turn into something far more serious, a movement people would actually follow. The recruitment attempt. At some point, the idea moved past quiet discussion and into something far more direct, because in 1933 and 1934, Smedley Butler was approached, not once, but multiple times, by individuals who wanted to bring him into the plan. The most notable of these was a bond salesman named Gerald Maguire, who claimed to be connected to powerful financial backers. He didn't arrive with a dramatic speech or a detailed blueprint laid out on the table. Instead, he started carefully, testing the ground. Conversations focused on veterans. Maguire talked about organising them, funding them, turning them into a unified force that could act when needed. At one point, he mentioned the possibility of assembling as many as 500,000 men, a number large enough to make any government pay attention very quickly. And the destination he had in mind? Washington, D.C. The idea was simple on the surface, a massive demonstration of strength, veterans marching together presenting themselves as a stabilising force during a time of national crisis. Publicly, it would look like support. Privately, it carried a different kind of pressure. Because when that many people show up in one place, organised and disciplined, they don't need to fire a single shot to influence decisions. Maguire also pointed to examples overseas. In Europe, he had seen organisations of veterans operating with political influence, acting as a kind of backbone for governments that valued order and control. He suggested something similar could work in the United States. And throughout these conversations, one assumption remained constant. Butler would be the one leading it. He would stand at the front. He would give it legitimacy. He would be the face people trusted. The financial support, the organisation, the broader direction, that would come from elsewhere, which made the proposal very clear. Even if it was never stated outright in a single sentence, they weren't asking Butler to join a movement. They were asking him to lead it. And they fully expected him to say yes. The decision that changed everything. The conversations went on for weeks, and at first glance, they may have sounded like loose talk between well-connected men with big ideas. But Smedley Butler had spent decades around people who made plans for a living. He knew how to read between the lines, and the more he listened, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't casual speculation. This was organised thinking, backed by money, with a specific outcome in mind. So instead of shutting the door immediately, Butler did something far more interesting. He kept listening. He met with Gerald Maguire again, let him talk, asked questions, gave just enough engagement to keep the conversation going. From the outside, it may have looked like interest. In reality, Butler was gathering information, details about funding, structure, and who might be involved behind the scenes. And the more details he collected, the less comfortable the situation became. Because by this point, the proposal had moved well beyond vague ideas about helping the country. There were numbers attached. There were expectations. There was a clear assumption that once the force was assembled, it would be used to apply pressure on the government in Washington. That's the moment where Butler made his decision. He wasn't going to lead anything. He was going to expose it. Now, that choice came with risks. Butler was a respected figure, but accusing powerful individuals of organising something like this could easily backfire. His reputation could be questioned, his motives could be challenged, and if he didn't have enough to support his claims, the entire story could collapse on him. He went ahead anyway. He began sharing what he had learned, first with journalists, then with officials. He prepared to testify and put everything on record. names, conversations, and the structure of what had been proposed to him, which changed the situation completely, because up to this point, the plan had existed in private, quiet, controlled, deniable. Now it was about to be dragged into public view, and once that happened, there was no putting it back. The congressional investigation. In November 1934, Butler testified before the McCormack-Dickstein Committee, a congressional body tasked with investigating subversive activities, and he didn't hold back. He laid out the conversations he had been part of. He described the approach made to him. He explained how a large force of veterans could be organised and used to apply pressure on the government. He even named individuals he believed were connected to the effort, including Gerald Maguire, who had acted as the main go-between. Now you'd expect a testimony like that, coming from a decorated general, to cause immediate shockwaves. And for a moment, it did. Butler wasn't some anonymous source. He had credibility, a public record, and a reputation that made his claims hard to dismiss outright. Newspapers picked up the story. People started paying attention. The idea that something like this had ever been discussed raised serious concerns. At the same time, the response from those accused came quickly. Denials, strong ones. Several of the figures Butler mentioned rejected the claims entirely, calling the whole thing exaggerated or completely false. And without direct written evidence or signed agreements, the situation became difficult to prove beyond doubt. The committee continued its investigation, interviewing witnesses and reviewing testimony, and when it released its findings, the conclusion landed in an interesting place. The committee stated that there was evidence suggesting that such a plan had been discussed, not proven in full detail and not dismissed either, which left the situation hanging in a very narrow space, serious enough to acknowledge, unclear enough to avoid immediate consequences. For a short moment, this looked like the beginning of a major political scandal. A decorated general had accused influential figures of discussing a plan to reshape the government. Congress had investigated, and parts of the story held up, which meant the next steps seemed obvious. Something was supposed to happen next. The silence that followed. Naturally, people assumed this would lead somewhere. Investigations would deepen, charges might follow, at the very least there would be consequences. That's how these things usually go. Except that isn't what happened. After the McCormack-Dickstein Committee released its findings, the story began to lose momentum. The committee acknowledged that evidence pointed toward discussions of such a scheme, and it even noted that attempts had been made to recruit Butler. That alone should have kept the spotlight firmly in place. Instead, the spotlight faded. No prosecutions followed, no major legal actions were taken against the individuals Butler had named, and in the public space, the tone of the story began to shift. Some newspapers treated it seriously, others leaned towards skepticism, suggesting the claims had been exaggerated or misunderstood. A few even framed it as little more than a wild story that had gotten out of hand, which created a strange situation. On one hand, a congressional committee had confirmed that elements of the plot were credible. On the other, there were no consequences that matched the scale of the accusation, and over time, that gap had an effect. The story stopped growing, coverage slowed, public attention moved on to other issues, because in the 1930s, there were plenty of them competing for attention. Within a relatively short period, something that had the potential to become one of the most significant political scandals in the country had quietly slipped out of focus. No dramatic ending, no clear resolution, just a set of claims, partially supported, left sitting in the background. And that's what makes this part of the story so unusual, because the plan had been exposed, the investigation had happened, the findings were on the record, and then everything simply stopped. By the time the story faded, the United States had already moved on to other problems, economic recovery, political battles, and eventually another global war. Anyway, what do you think? Was this story fully exposed, or only the part we were allowed to see? Share your thoughts in the comment section below, leave a like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more amazing videos like this one.